Welcome to our deep dive into the world of TB. Now, as medical microbiologists, I know you're all familiar with the basics, but today we're going beyond the cough and really diving into some surprising facts about TB. We'll be drawing from Microbiology, the CDC, and the always visually stunning microbe canvas. So get ready to learn something new about this ancient foe, because TB still has a few tricks up its sleeve.
You know what's really interesting about TB? It can actually affect any part of the body. It's not just a lung disease.
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so we tend to focus on the pulmonary aspects, but TB can also show up in lymph nodes, bones, even the brain.
Really?
Yeah, so this just speaks to how adaptable Mycobacterium tuberculosis is, and it really highlights the challenges we face when it comes to diagnosis and treatment.
That's a good point. It really emphasizes how complex this disease is, especially when you consider that 14 of the world is infected with TB bacteria.
Right, but it's important to remember that most of those people have latent TB, so their immune systems are keeping the bacteria under control.
That makes sense.
But the bacteria is still there, just lying dormant, waiting to reactivate.
So why is Mycobacterium tuberculosis so good at this? Like, what makes it able to hide out in the body for so long?
Well, one of the key factors is how incredibly slow it grows.
How slow are we talking?
So, unlike other bacteria that might double in a few minutes, Mycobacterium tuberculosis can take up to 20 hours for a single cell to divide.
Wow, that's really slow.
And this slow growth makes it really difficult to culture in the lab. So it means patients might have to wait a long time to get diagnosed. And it's also one of the reasons why treatment can take months, because you need this complex regimen of multiple antibiotics.
It's crazy to think about how different it is from most of the other bacteria that we're used to dealing with.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just the slow growth. Mycobacterium tuberculosis can also survive and even thrive inside macrophages.
Wait, isn't that the immune cell that's supposed to destroy it?
Exactly.
Like it's hiding in plain sight.
Right. It's almost like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Wow, that's incredible.
And to make things even more complicated, it forms these aggregates called granulomas.
Granulomas, can you remind me what those are again?
So these are basically clumps of infected macrophages. They can wall off the bacteria from the rest of the immune system.
Oh, so it's like a fortress for the bacteria.
Precisely. And while granulomas can help contain the infection, they can also cause long-term damage to the lungs.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
It's amazing how this microscopic battle is playing out inside our bodies. But before we get too deep into the microbiology, I think it's worth taking a step back and thinking about how people understood TB before we even knew what bacteria were.
That's a great point. Imagine you're living centuries ago, and you're watching your loved ones waste away. You have no idea why this is happening. It's not surprising that people would turn to supernatural explanations.
Like vampires.
Exactly. TB was often seen as this mysterious force that was draining the life out of people.
That's fascinating. And it really highlights how intertwined TB has been with culture and folklore throughout history.
Right. And it wasn't just folklore. TB had a huge impact on the arts as well. Many famous figures like Keats, Dostoevsky, and Chopin suffered from TB, and their experiences with the disease often influenced their work.
Wow, I never thought about it like that. It really makes you appreciate the long shadow this tiny bacterium has cast over human history.
Yeah.
And it makes you appreciate the progress we've made since Robert Koch discovered Mycobacterium tuberculosis in 1882.
Definitely, Koch's discovery revolutionized our understanding of TB, and it really paved the way for the development of effective treatments.
It's true.
But as we've seen, this bacterium is constantly evolving, and it's always finding new ways to survive.
So let's talk about those survival strategies. What makes Mycobacterium tuberculosis so tough to kill from a microbiological perspective?
Well, one of the key features is its outer coat. It's made of mycolic acids.
Mycolic acids, those are the long-chain fatty acids, right?
Yep. And they create this waxy layer that makes the bacterium resistant to a lot of disinfectants and even some antibiotics.
So that's why it can survive in the air for so long.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, the infectious dose is incredibly small. Less than 10 bacteria can actually be enough to establish an infection.
Wow, less than 10.
It's a really potent pathogen.
It really emphasizes the importance of things like cough etiquette and early detection.
Absolutely.
Speaking of detection, we've got the tuberculin skin test.
Yeah.
But I've heard it's not always reliable.
Yeah, so the tuberculin skin test, or the MAN2 test, has been used for a long time, but it can't actually tell the difference between latent and active infection. And it can also be affected by prior BCG vaccination.
Right, the BCG vaccine. It's supposed to protect against TB, But it's not a perfect solution.
Yeah, it's a complex issue. The BCG vaccine does offer some protection, especially for young children, but its effectiveness can vary quite a bit, and it doesn't last forever, and it doesn't fully protect against pulmonary TB.
So we've got this incredibly resilient bacteria, a vaccine that helps, but isn't perfect, and 14 of the world's population carrying this potential time bomb.
Yeah.
That sounds like a recipe for a global health crisis.
Well, it definitely is a major challenge, but before we get into the darker side of TB, like drug resistance, I think it's important to remember how far we've come.
That's true. The discovery of antibiotics was a game changer.
Right.
For a while, it seemed like TB might actually become a disease of the past.
Yeah.
But there's always a but in microbiology, isn't there?
Always.
And in this case, it's the rise of drug resistance.
Yeah, it's almost like Mycobacterium tuberculosis has been watching us and figuring out how to outsmart our strategies.
So that brings us to multi-drug resistant TB, MDR-TB. For those who aren't as familiar, can you explain what that means?
MDR-TB refers to strains of TB that are resistant to at least two of the most powerful first-line antibiotics, isoniazid and rifampin.
And those are the drugs that have been the standard treatment for decades, right?
Exactly. So when those drugs don't work anymore, it's a huge problem.
So what happens then if the first-line drugs aren't effective? What are the other treatment options?
Treatment for MDR-TB is much more complicated. It takes longer and it's way more expensive. We have to use second-line drugs, which often have more side effects. And the treatment can last up to 2 years.
2 years. That's a huge burden for patients, both physically and emotionally. And I imagine it puts a strain on healthcare systems, too.
Oh, definitely. MDR-TB is a major challenge for public health programs all over the world. And to make things even worse, there's also extensively drug-resistant TB.
Or XDR-TB.
XDR-TB. That sounds even scarier than MDR-TB. What's the difference?
XDR-TB is resistant to even more drugs, including some of the key second-line antibiotics. So that leaves us with very few treatment
It
options.
sounds like we're headed for a crisis if this drug resistance keeps spreading.
It's definitely a major concern.
So what can we do about it? What strategies are being used to address this problem?
Well, one of the most important things is responsible antibiotic stewardship. We need to make sure that antibiotics are only used when they're really needed, and that they're used correctly. The right dose, the right duration.
That makes sense. Overuse and misuse of antibiotics are big drivers of drug resistance, so education is key, both for healthcare professionals and the public.
Prevention is always better than cure, especially when we're dealing with something as adaptable as Mycobacterium tuberculosis. But what about the people who are already battling drug-resistant strains? Is there any hope for new treatments on the horizon?
There is some promising research going on. Scientists are exploring new drugs that could target Mycobacterium tuberculosis in different ways. And there's also renewed interest in older approaches, like surgery.
Surgery? For TB? It seems like we're going back in time.
Well, with drug-resistant TB becoming more common, surgery is making a comeback, especially in cases where medications alone aren't working.
So in those cases, surgery could be a lifesaver.
Exactly. It just goes to show how complex and challenging the treatment of drug-resistant TB can be.
It really does. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. We've learned so much about the history of TB, the microbiology of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, and the daunting challenge of drug resistance. It's clear that this ancient foe is far from defeated.
That's for sure. TB is still a serious global health threat. And as medical microbiologists, your expertise is absolutely critical in this fight.
I agree. We need all hands on deck to combat this persistent adversary.
And this raises a really important question for you to think about. With drug resistance increasing and current treatments having limitations, what areas of research or technological advancements do you think hold the most promise for controlling TB in the future?
That's a great question. And it really emphasizes how important it is to stay informed and involved in the fight against TB.
We've really only scratched the surface of this topic. There's still so much more to learn about how Mycobacterium tuberculosis interacts with the immune system, the social and economic factors that contribute to the spread of TB, and the development of new diagnostic tools and vaccines, not to mention the ongoing search for more effective treatments.
It's a vast and constantly evolving field, and it demands our continued curiosity and dedication. It really makes you realize that TB is so much more than just a bug, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just a scientific problem either. It's a social and economic problem as well.
Right, like poverty and malnutrition, overcrowded living conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Those all play a role in how TB spreads.
Exactly. And they make treatment so much harder.
It shows just how important it is to think about TB from different angles.
Yeah. We need a multifaceted approach. We can't just focus on the biology. We have to address the social determinants of health, too.
I think this deep dive has really opened my eyes to the true complexity of TB.
I'm glad to hear that. It's been a really great conversation.
So to our listener, the medical microbiologist out there, I hope this deep dive has given you some new insights into TB. As we've seen, it's a persistent and ever-evolving threat, and we need to stay vigilant.
Absolutely. Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep working to fight this global health threat.
Your expertise is more important than ever. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of TB. We hope you enjoyed the deep dive.
And until next time, stay curious.